Have you ever opened an old cookbook and felt like you were stepping into a time machine? Hidden between the faded pages of Betty Crocker's mid-century classics are recipes that once defined family dinners, church potlucks, and holiday spreads, yet today, they've almost disappeared from American tables. These weren't just meals, they were snapshots of an era, shaped by post-war optimism, mid-century trends, and the rise of convenience cooking. From whimsical names that made kids smile to show-stopping dishes meant to impress company, Betty Crocker's recipes told the story of how America cooked, celebrated, and gathered. But as decades passed and tastes changed, many of these quirky, comforting, and sometimes downright unusual creations slipped quietly into the past. That's exactly what we're bringing back today. In this video, we'll revisit 12 forgotten Betty Crocker recipes, each one a little slice of culinary history. These dishes, published between the 1940s and the 1980s, capture the spirit of their times, from the playful party foods of the space age to the hearty casseroles that warmed up cold winter nights. Some might make you nostalgic for your grandmother's kitchen, while others will surprise you with just how bold, and sometimes bizarre, mid-century cooking could be. So if you love a good dose of nostalgia, buckle up. We're about to uncover recipes with names as fun as their flavors, dishes that remind us of how food once brought families together around the table. And hey, if you're new here and love exploring forgotten food traditions, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more culinary journeys into America's past. Now, let's dive into the first forgotten gem on our list. Imagine hosting a party in the early 1970s. The space race was still fresh in everyone's mind, astronauts were national heroes, and kids were glued to the TV dreaming of rockets and moon landings. Betty Crocker, always tuned into the cultural moment, decided to bring that excitement straight to the dinner table. The result? A whimsical little recipe called Space Visitors. These weren't just dinner rolls, they were edible party guests. Each visitor was a pillowy yeast bun, carefully shaped to resemble a friendly alien. The magic touch came from the antennae, colorful jelly beans perched on top, giving the buns a playful, otherworldly look. Parents loved them because they were inexpensive and easy to make, and kids adored them because, well, who wouldn't want to bite into a smiling space creature? The recipe captured a generation's imagination. It was part of a larger trend of novelty foods, dishes designed to entertain as much as they fed. Think of it as kitchen theater, where creativity mattered just as much as flavor. And while the rolls themselves tasted like any classic homemade bread, soft, slightly sweet, perfect with butter, the presentation turned them into the life of the party. Today, space visitors have all but vanished from recipe cards and cookbooks. But they remind us of a time when food was about more than just nourishment. It was about fun, about bringing people together, and about reflecting the wonder of the world outside, whether that was the family living room or the surface of the moon. So next time you bake bread, imagine shaping it into something playful. Who knows? You might just bring back a little 1970s magic. Stay tuned, because our next forgotten recipe is even stranger, and it might just surprise you. By the early 1980s, America's love affair with burgers was stronger than ever. Fast food chains were booming, backyard cookouts were a summer ritual, and Betty Crocker knew that even a simple hamburger could use a creative twist. Enter the beef boulette burger, a forgotten gem from the Betty Crocker recipe card library of 1981. The word boulette comes from the French, meaning little ball, and that's exactly what these burgers were. Instead of a flat patty, ground beef was mixed with chopped onions, parsley, and seasonings, then shaped into plump, rounded portions. But what set them apart wasn't the shape, it was the secret ingredient, sour cream. Blended right into the meat, it gave the burgers a rich, tangy flavor and kept every bite tender and juicy. Broiled or grilled, the boulettes developed a savory crust on the outside while staying moist inside. They were hearty enough to stand alone with a side of potatoes, but they could also be tucked into buns for a more adventurous take on the American classic. Families loved them because they felt a little more gourmet without being complicated, a small nod to European cooking trends creeping into American kitchens at the time. But like many quirky recipes of the era, beef boulette burgers didn't survive the decades. As leaner, health-focused meals took over in the late 80s and 90s, this indulgent, sour cream-laden burger quietly faded into obscurity. Still, the recipe tells a story of its time, when cooks weren't afraid to experiment, when even a weeknight dinner could feel like something special. And honestly, doesn't the idea of a juicy, sour cream-infused burger sound worth bringing back? Stick around, because our next forgotten dish wasn't just food. It was a full-blown party spectacle. The 1950s were an era of showmanship in the American kitchen. Food wasn't just about flavor, it was about spectacle. And nothing embodied that spirit quite like Betty Crocker's unforgettable flaming cabbage, a dish that turned a simple vegetable into the centerpiece of an evening party. Picture it, a hollowed-out head of cabbage, placed proudly in the center of the table. Inside, a small can of cooking fuel was lit, sending up a dancing flame. Around the edges, cocktail sausages or small skewers of meat were arranged, ready to be roasted right at the table. Guests would huddle around, laughing, chatting, and cooking their bite-sized snacks over the fiery cabbage like campers at a suburban campfire. It was clever, thrifty, and perfectly in tune with the mid-century love of novelty. After all, this was the decade of Jell-O molds, fruit salads shaped like towers, and aspics that shimmered like jewels. A flaming cabbage wasn't just food, it was entertainment. It gave homemakers a way to impress guests without breaking the bank, turning a humble vegetable into something dramatic and unforgettable. Of course, the flaming cabbage didn't stand the test of time. Concerns over safety, changing tastes, and a shift toward more practical cooking eventually left it behind. Today, the idea of setting a cabbage on fire in the middle of your dining room sounds almost absurd. But back then? It was the height of mid-century fun. The flaming cabbage reminds us that food has always been about more than eating, it's about creating moments, laughter, and memories. And for just a flicker of flame, Betty Crocker managed to turn dinner into a show. Up next, we're diving into a recipe with a cheeky name and a surprising kick, straight out of the 1970s. The 1970s were a decade of bold experiments in the kitchen. Betty Crocker was right in step with the times, introducing dishes that pushed flavor and presentation into playful new territory. One of the quirkiest was a party appetizer with an unforgettable name, Wild-Eyed Rose. At first glance, it looked like simple meatballs. But these weren't your ordinary cocktail bites. The mixture blended ground beef with potatoes, onions, and spices, hearty, humble ingredients. Then came the twist, whiskey. A splash of the strong stuff gave the meatballs a boozy depth of flavor, a nod to the growing popularity of cocktail culture at the time. Once cooked and chilled, the meatballs were sliced open, revealing a pocket ready to be filled with chive-flavored cream cheese. The result was both savory and tangy, with a creamy center that caught guests off guard in the best way. The name Wild-Eyed Rose itself added to the fun, half whimsical, half daring, perfect for a 1970s party spread. These little bites were more than food. They reflected the social atmosphere of the era, when entertaining at home was as much about creativity as it was about hospitality. Serving something unusual, even cheeky, was a way to break the ice, spark conversation, and keep the evening lively. But like many quirky appetizers of the time, wild-eyed rose faded into obscurity as trends shifted. Today, it feels almost forgotten, a relic of when Betty Crocker recipes weren't just about flavor, but about bringing a little drama and surprise to the table. Still, one bite of these whiskey-laced, cream cheese-filled meatballs, and you'd understand why they made such an impression. And coming up next, we'll uncover a dish with a name as musical as its flavor, minstrel pie. By the late 1970s, casseroles were the kings of the American dinner table. Families wanted meals that were hearty, comforting, and could stretch to feed a crowd without much fuss. Betty Crocker knew this better than anyone, and that's where the curious recipe for minstrel pie comes in. The name alone makes you stop and wonder. Why minstrel? Some say it was inspired by old European traditions, where hearty meat pies kept traveling performers fed during long journeys. Whatever its roots, in Betty Crocker's version, it was pure comfort food dressed up with a whimsical title. At its heart, minstrel pie was a layered casserole. The base was a seasoned ground beef and potato mixture, almost like an Irish-inspired meatloaf. On top came a thick layer of creamy, buttery mashed potatoes, spread edge to edge like a golden crust. A sprinkle of cheddar cheese melted across the top sealed it together, giving every bite a balance of savory meat, fluffy potato, and gooey cheese. This dish wasn't flashy like the flaming cabbage or playful like Space Visitors. Instead, it was the kind of meal that wrapped a family in warmth on a chilly night. It reflected the era's values, stretching simple ingredients, creating comfort from the basics, and making dinnertime feel like an event without breaking the budget. But over time, minstrel pie disappeared from recipe boxes. Shepherd's pie and other classics survived, but this uniquely named cousin faded into obscurity, remembered only by the families who once scooped it steaming from the oven. Still, the story of minstrel pie reminds us that even the humblest dishes carry history, tales of thrift, tradition, and the joy of gathering around the table. Next, we'll take a turn back into whimsy with a dish so strange, it had people eating right out of a potato boat. The mid-1970s were full of playful, imaginative recipes that blurred the line between food and storytelling. Betty Crocker leaned right into that trend with one of her most whimsical creations, 3 Men in a Boat. And no, this wasn't just a casserole with a funny name, it was literally a baked potato turned into a boat. Here's how it worked. A large potato was baked until fluffy inside, then carefully hollowed out. The scooped potato filling was mixed with creamed dried beef, a budget-friendly, salty staple of the time, and spooned back into the potato hull. The real magic, though, was in the garnish. 3 mushroom halves were planted on top, standing upright as the men in the little starchy vessel. It was a recipe designed to charm. Children loved the playful presentation, while adults appreciated the nostalgia of a meal that didn't take itself too seriously. Like many Betty Crocker creations of the 70s, it turned everyday ingredients into an imaginative display, proving that dinner could be both fun and filling. Of course, dishes like 3 Men in a Boat weren't meant to last forever. They reflected a very specific moment in American kitchens, when novelty counted just as much as nutrition. Today, it might seem quirky, even silly, but in its time, it was a recipe that sparked smiles around the dinner table. More than anything, this dish reminds us how food has always been a canvas for creativity. It wasn't just about what you served, it was about how you made people feel when they saw it. And in this case, Betty Crocker managed to turn an ordinary potato into a story. Coming up next, we'll revisit a recipe that turned humble eggs into a golden, comforting breakfast classic. In the 1950s, breakfast wasn't just the most important meal of the day, it was a chance to show off a little creativity in the kitchen. And Betty Crocker's eggs à la goldenrod was a dish that transformed the simplest of ingredients into something elegant and comforting. The recipe began with hard-boiled eggs, a staple in almost every American home. The whites were chopped finely and folded into a rich, velvety white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. This creamy mixture was then poured generously over buttered toast, turning plain bread into a warm, savory foundation. But the real magic came from the yolks. They were mashed and sprinkled across the top like golden confetti, giving the dish both its sunny color and its memorable name. It was the kind of recipe that spoke to post-war thrift and ingenuity. Eggs were inexpensive, filling, and easy to prepare, yet this dish elevated them into something that felt almost special occasion. Homemakers could serve it at breakfast, brunch, or even supper when budgets were tight, and it never failed to bring comfort to the table. Eggs à la goldenrod wasn't flashy, but it was deeply nostalgic, a dish many children of the 1950s remembered eating on lazy Sunday mornings or after church gatherings. Over time, as convenience foods took over, recipes like this faded quietly into the background, replaced by boxed mixes and quick-fix meals. But there's something timeless about it. The creamy sauce, the hearty toast, the cheerful burst of yolk, it's a reminder that even the humblest foods can feel like a hug on a plate. And up next, we're heading into the 1960s with a recipe that combined bold flavor with a playful presentation, sombrero pie. By the mid-1960s, American kitchens were beginning to experiment with flavors from beyond their borders. Influences from Mexico and the American Southwest crept into cookbooks, and Betty Crocker was quick to put her own playful spin on them. One standout creation was the sombrero pie, a dish that blended hearty ingredients with a name and look that promised fun at the dinner table. At its base, sombrero pie was a savory meat filling, ground beef and pork seasoned with chili powder, onions, and corn. Sometimes beans or tomatoes were added to stretch the dish even further. But what made it unique was the crust. Instead of a standard pie shell, a golden cornmeal pastry was pressed over the top, baked until it puffed and browned into a wide, dome-like shape. Once it emerged from the oven, it looked almost like a sombrero, complete with a brim of flaky edges. It wasn't authentic Mexican food, far from it, but it reflected the era's curiosity with exotic flavors and the American tendency to adapt them into comforting, family-style dishes. For homemakers of the 1960s, sombrero pie was a way to bring something new and exciting to the table without straying too far from familiar flavors. Served piping hot and cut into wedges, it was filling, festive, and ideal for potlucks or family dinners. Kids loved the playful name, while adults appreciated the bold, zesty kick compared to the usual weeknight casseroles. Over time, though, dishes like sombrero pie fell out of favor as authentic Mexican cuisine became more widely appreciated and Americans shifted toward convenient meals. Yet it remains a fascinating snapshot of mid-century creativity, when even a humble casserole could carry the flair of a fiesta. Coming up next, we'll look at a dish with a name as curious as its texture, Hobo hike. The 1970s were a playground of experimental recipes, where Betty Crocker often tested the boundaries of what counted as comfort food. One of the most curious creations to come out of that era was a dish with an equally curious name, Hobo hike. Unlike the fun potato boats or playful bread rolls of earlier decades, this recipe was more of a budget-friendly casserole, though its unusual texture made it memorable. At its core, Hobo hike was made from Bisquick, the all-purpose baking mix that Betty Crocker promoted as the solution for busy families. The mix was stirred with milk and other simple ingredients to create a dense, almost pudding-like base. Baked in a dish, it formed into what was described as a hearty, stick-to-your-ribs pie, though many who remembered it joked that it leaned more toward mush. Still, the name alone gave it character. Calling it Hobo hike tied the dish to the rugged imagery of thrift, travel, and resourcefulness, a theme that resonated with the 1970s back-to-basics movement. At a time when economic uncertainty made families more conscious of stretching their groceries, dishes like this promised to fill bellies without emptying wallets. For children, it was often just another quirky casserole. For homemakers, it was a creative way to transform pantry staples into something that at least looked like a complete meal. And while the flavor wasn't particularly bold, the name stuck in people's minds long after the recipe itself faded from the spotlight. Today, Hobo hike is a reminder of how food can reflect the challenges of its time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical, and in its own way, it carried the story of families making do with what they had. Next, we'll uncover a dessert with roots in nursery rhyme nostalgia, Jack Horner prune cake. Some recipes are remembered not just for their flavor, but for the stories tucked into their names. Betty Crocker's Jack Horner prune cake was one of those dishes, a mid-century dessert that blended old-fashioned thrift with a whimsical nod to childhood rhyme. The name comes straight from the nursery. Little Jack Horner sat in a corner, eating a Christmas pie. Inspired by that image, Betty Crocker offered a cake that carried both holiday spirit and a touch of playful nostalgia. Instead of the pie Jack ate in the rhyme, this dessert came as a moist, spiced cake studded with prunes, a fruit that was inexpensive, filling, and beloved in older generations for both flavor and practicality. The batter was rich with warm spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, that gave it the cozy aroma of a winter kitchen. The prunes themselves, chopped and folded into the mix, added sweetness and texture, keeping the cake moist long after baking. Sometimes it was finished with a simple glaze or powdered sugar, though many families enjoyed it plain, letting the fruit and spice speak for themselves. In the 1960s, this was a dessert that carried weight. It felt old-world, thrifty, and just a little whimsical, making it perfect for church potlucks, holiday gatherings, or Sunday suppers. But as tastes modernized and lighter, flashier cakes took center stage, prune cake slowly slipped from memory, its name lingering more in curiosity than in practice. Yet there's something endearing about the Jack Horner prune cake. It's a reminder of when recipes weren't afraid to mix tradition with playfulness, when even a nursery rhyme could inspire a dish that brought families together. Next, we'll step into one of the most unusual trends of the 1970s, a chicken salad that wobbled on the table, Jellied chicken salad. If there's one recipe that truly captures the daring spirit of 1970s cooking, it's Jellied chicken salad. Today, it might raise eyebrows, but back then, it was a centerpiece dish meant to impress. The idea combined two mid-century obsessions, mold gelatin and cold salads. Betty Crocker leaned into this trend by offering a recipe that transformed chicken salad, already a classic, into something show-stopping. The process began with cooked chicken, often shredded or diced, mixed with celery, olives, pimentos, and sometimes even chopped hard-boiled eggs. Then came the twist. The entire mixture was suspended in lemon or savory gelatin, poured into a mold, and chilled until firm. When it was unmolded onto a platter, it looked like something out of a magazine spread, shiny, colorful, and perfectly shaped. Garnished with lettuce, sliced cucumbers, or sprigs of parsley, it became the kind of dish that made guests stop and stare. It wasn't just food, it was presentation, art on a plate. For many families, serving Jellied chicken salad meant you were keeping up with culinary fashion. It was a conversation starter at luncheons, bridal showers, and potlucks. While its flavor leaned tangy and savory, with the gelatin binding everything together, its real strength was in how it looked on the table. But as the years passed, mold salads fell out of favor. People began preferring fresher, simpler, and less processed meals. Today, the very idea of chicken salad inside a wobbly gelatin mold feels like a relic of another time. And yet, it stands as a fascinating snapshot of how creativity and culture shaped the American table. The 1970s weren't afraid to experiment, even if the results sometimes puzzled future generations. Few dishes represent the post-war American kitchen better than hamburger pie. In the 1950s, Betty Crocker promoted it as the perfect family dinner, filling, frugal, and fun. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a snapshot of suburban comfort, where casseroles ruled the table and ground beef reigned supreme. The dish started with a hearty base of seasoned hamburger, onions, and sometimes vegetables like corn or green beans. This savory layer was pressed into a pie plate, forming a meaty crust. Then came the signature topping, a fluffy layer of mashed potatoes, spread across the top like frosting on a cake. A sprinkle of cheese or paprika sealed the deal, and into the oven it went. When it emerged, golden and bubbling, it was more than just food, it was a symbol of togetherness. Families gathered around the table, passing plates and sharing stories of their day. For many children, the memory of digging into that first bite, crispy on the edges, creamy on top, rich in the middle, was the taste of home. In cookbooks and advertisements, hamburger pie was often framed as a modern homemaker's solution, a way to stretch a pound of beef into a full meal without sacrificing flavor. It reflected the practicality of the era when convenience and creativity walked hand in hand. Though it has faded from most kitchens today, replaced by faster weeknight meals, hamburger pie still lingers in the memories of those who grew up with it. It represents a time when comfort food was simple, affordable, and deeply connected to family life. And that brings us to the end of our journey through 12 forgotten Betty Crocker recipes, a delicious reminder of how the past can still inspire our tables today.